Today, I happened to look at the news this morning, and one of the things in it has a headline, "Superbugs pretend to be vulnerable to medication." And this apparently is a story about really, really sneaky superbugs who are defeating some of the therapeutics that have been thrown against them by hiding amongst ones that are actually vulnerable to medication. So it makes them even harder to find. And so antibiotics may be hitting some, but not others. So when I read the first couple of paragraphs of this, I thought, 100 years ago, nobody would have even known what that meant. None of it would have made any sense at all. It would have sounded like foreign language. So the stuff I'm going to be talking about today is actually very recent, really. And as it turns out, if you're online, if you're listening to news, if you're reading it, it's very current at the moment. The issue of how we get sick, what it is, it's not as straightforward as we thought it was. So this is a story of how they thought it was straightforward about how we got sick, and then how we've discovered actually it's not quite as positive an answer as we thought it was. So, in order to explain this, I've got this rather strange-looking person here, who I'll tell you about him in a minute. The hunt for the magic bullet. Magic bullet is a phrase you hear all the time now. It's basically meaning something that hits something else inevitably, all the time, and kills it. This idea, which we're so familiar with because we use that phrase all the time, actually came from something that most of you probably haven't heard of at all. In fact, this bloke here. His name was Caspar, the hunter, and he was a hero of a folk tale. The reason he's all done up like that in this picture is that this folk tale was actually made into an opera at the beginning of the 19th century, called in German, if you know German, Der Freischütz, like the hunter. So, true to his name, you can see here, he's got his gun. Might not be your image of a hunter exactly, but obviously early 19th century people who put on operas thought that was what a hunter looked like. So, he's off to hunt his animals. Problem, particularly with this gun that he's got, an early 19th century one, he'd be probably more likely to do damage to himself than any animal, because they weren't very accurate, to be perfectly honest. They had a huge kickback and really weren't very dangerous. So imagine if you were a hunter, you fired your bullet from one of the new guns, and it hit your target every time. That's like the most wonderful thing that could ever happen to you. I know we might find that a bit hard to understand these days, but nevertheless. What does stupid Caspar do? Like they do in fairy tales, nursery rhymes, folk tales. He made a pact with the devil, didn't he? I mean, you'd think they'd learn, but they never do. So he made a pact with the devil that every bullet from his gun would hit its target, except occasionally there would be one that didn't, the devil's bullet, and he'd never know which one that was going to be. Stupid kind of deal, you might think, but obviously he thought he was doing quite well out of it. So from this folk tale of this magic bullet comes this concept that we've got at the moment. How on earth did we come to think of something like antibiotics as a magic bullet? Well, little background very quickly before we get on to more recent stuff. How did this happen? What are antibiotics? And as I mentioned at the beginning, the danger of antibiotic overuse, and how can the bugs that are being shot at actually get too clever for the antibiotics, which it would appear they already have done. So, where does this notion come? This way of firing a substance into the human body that'll kill the microbes, but, notice the important bit here, it'll leave the rest of the body unharmed. That's quite a tricky thing to do. I mean, a lot of things that people have swallowed in the past to get rid of sickness has actually done more harm than good. And we know nowadays that's still the case with radiotherapy, chemotherapy. It still does a lot of harm to the body, even though it might kill the cancer cells in the process. So how do you manage to set this one up? The metaphor actually came, as well as from Caspar the hunter, from 19th century wars and armaments manufacturing. I mean, we know now 19th century was a huge period of making new armaments, big guns, guns on wheels that you could push around, revolvers, all kinds of automatic guns like that. So this idea of shooting something into something with a bullet comes from this 19th century rather fierce armament kind of idea. Initially, in fact, they didn't talk about bullets. They didn't quite pick that metaphor up until later. It was actually little torpedoes that the antibiotics were compared to at first. Like torpedoes that went under the water and hit submarines, for example. It was used that much of a metaphor. But gradually, the bullet one took over, and we'll see why. Okay. Back just to remind you a little bit to fit in with one of the other lectures we did about where this all fits in and where it meets up. So what are these microbes that are going to be shot at then? We did talk a bit about this last week, but I'll just remind you. Remember, there was a medical doctor, a physician called Fracastorius in the 16th century in Italy. Latin name, so he was university educated. He wrote the poem with the rather strange tertiary as titles about syphilis. Syphilis was his hero. But as you can see, they've hedged their bets here, and it says Syphilis, or a poetic history of the French disease. Plainly, this wasn't a book from France then. It was obviously a book from the UK who were blaming it on France. So this horrible disease that had taken over in the 16th and 17th century was giving people a clue as to what might be causing disease. Further developments, yes. Microscopy. By the 17th century, you could look down a microscope and see things moving about. But remember, initially, it wasn't very sophisticated. It didn't get sophisticated until mid-19th century, when it was almost compulsory, if you were a physician or even a surgeon, to be able to look down a microscope and see in the fluids things moving around. Microbe hunting in humans and animals became a huge project in the 19th century. Let's find the microbes, let's use the laboratory process on them to fix them and stain them, look at the shape of them through our microscope, and then give them a name. Let's then try and do the backward stage of associating them with a particular disease. What kind of disease did we inject into an animal? What does it look like when you get the microbe out of them again? If you're interested in that, that's called Koch's postulates, and you can Google it if you're really interested to hear. It's a bit complicated, but that's the way you do it. Okay, so as I said, fixing and staining, injecting into an animal to see if the same symptoms result. This was the laboratory method of trying to spot the microbe, as it were. In the meantime, as I mentioned last week, very briefly at the end, syphilis, sadly, was still around. Renamed, perhaps, venereal disease, because it turned out it wasn't just one disease. There were quite a few. We would call them sexually transmitted diseases these days. And it was a very, very shameful affliction. Here's where we get to this notion of some diseases don't just make you sick. They also make you slightly ashamed because there's a moral element to them. As we'll see in a minute, this certainly wasn't the last one in this category. So not only are you feeling sick and rotten, but you're also feeling ashamed that you're feeling sick and rotten, which isn't very wonderful. Of course, syphilis was blamed on prostitutes, which is what these two ladies are here. Of course, nobody talked about their clients very much, but they were the ones who were blamed for passing on this disease, because by this stage everybody knew it was passed on, and mainly sexually, at least very close contact. The man here on your right was what used to be known as a roué, in other words, a man who wasn't very respectable. He's got, they've carefully highlighted them for you, just in case you missed them. He's got the syphilitic sores on his face, and that was even worse. We'll hear more about this next week when we talk about smallpox and other diseases like that. Something that appears on your face. is almost like an outward mark that you've done something wrong. You can't disguise it with your clothes. It's there on your face. So deliberately, this is a photograph here from the late 19th century. This man is not looking at the camera. 19th century pictures and photographs told you a story. And the story that these photographs are telling you is that the two girls don't feel particularly guilty at all. They're looking straight at the camera as if, so what? The man is deeply ashamed and is looking down. And that's a sign he won't meet the, he was probably told to do it, but nevertheless, for the benefit of the picture, this is the image, this is the message that's supposed to be getting over, that it's a deeply shameful disease to have. Not only, of course, was it deeply shameful, but it was also a really horrible one. The reason I'm making a lot of this is that it's important that it was particularly awful. That was why there was some move to actually act against it, as we'll see. Here's the lady who's got syphilis has obviously affected her bones, and in this case, her facial bones. Syphilis it goes into the bones, we know that. It also causes horrible scarring on the body, in this case, and somebody's back. So this was primary, you got primary syphilis, that was what affected you initially. Confusingly, it looked as if it went away because your symptoms vanished. But then they came back again. And that was secondary syphilis. Then, if you were very, very unlucky indeed, you got what was referred to as tertiary syphilis. It was, in the 19th century, it was called GPI, which was general paralysis of the insane. And we think now that a lot of people who were consigned to mental asylums, as they called them in those days, actually were probably suffering from tertiary syphilis and could have done with being treated, not just being tied up. But you can see the kind of treatment they got, which this may have been a bit extreme, to be fair. But nevertheless, GPI caused your brain not to function properly. It caused you to be very violent and obstreperous. So, of course, in these places, they locked you up. So this was a really horrible disease with, if you were very unlucky, a very, very horrible ending. So, big incentive to try to do something about this. We know what causes it, but how can we cure it? Well, part of the solution for a cure came from a rather strange source. 19th century, not all over the world, but certainly in Western societies, and some Eastern ones as well, was referred to as the arsenic century. Arsenic is, of course, in large doses a poison, but it was in the environment everywhere. I mean, a bit like now we're hearing about natural asbestos, as it were, that's around us much more than we think. Arsenic was around all over the place. Not only was it an all-purpose drug of choice, because as with many therapeutics, you take it in a small dose, it's beneficial. You take it in a large dose, it's very, very unbeneficial. And if you take it in an extremely large dose, it kills you. So taken in a small dose, people did claim it was beneficial. Apparently it made them feel better. But it was unregulated. It was easily obtainable. You didn't need a prescription or anything like that. You just went and asked for it. People went to chemist shops, pharmacists, and asked for some arsenic to kill rats, if that's what they wanted it for. It was also in face washes for women. It was used as a stimulant, like a kind of tonic. And it was used in paper and wallpaper. And in fact, nowadays, even in Australia and Sydney, if they're renovating a really old house from the 19th century, not only do they have to be careful about the asbestos, they also have to be really careful that there isn't arsenic in the paint and wallpaper, because people were known to be poisoned, particularly with the green paint, Shields green it was called, that had masses of arsenic in it. So you've got to be, be all suited up for that kind of thing these days. So, doesn't seem like an obvious choice for research, but nevertheless, because it was so common, it was so easily available, people knew about it. In fact, it was used as the basis for the first research into magic bullets. So let's see how and who. Research, now we're into the early 1900s. Paul Erlich, here you can see a German doctor, had a university post, good researcher. And here, for the first time, we have research cooperation between East and West. He has a Japanese student who comes over to share in the research and obviously take the research back with him to his own country. They do various research methods in their laboratory. You can read all about it if you Google any of them, looking for a compound based on arsenic that might attack this horrible microbe that was causing syphilis, but not attack the bodies of the patients. Very tricky. It took them so long to do this that, in fact, the final one, which had the trade name of Salvarsan, 606. 606 because they'd tried 605 compounds before that, before they got it right. What did they do? To cut a very long story short, of course they used animals as their research project. You could still do that. They used rabbits. They would infect them with the syphilis spirochete, and they would then try the various compounds on the animals to see whether it had any effect. In other words, could they then test their blood and see whether the spirochete was still there, but the animals were quite healthy, and it took them all that time to do it. First few goes, things happened like the animals went blind. They had horrible side effects. But by 606, apparently the animals didn't. Always different on humans, of course. So what did they do? They took their Salvarsan off to the local big public hospital, didn't they? Remember all these people in huge hospitals who were public patients? Not much choice about what was done to them. And anyway, if you had syphilis, were you really caring? This was a case where you can do a trial, not like nowadays with an ethics committee, but still a trial, because your patients are probably going to die anyway. So any intervention can, in a way, be justified. We'll hear about another one in a minute. So you can see there the trade Salvarsan is actually produced commercially. One of the first big commercial pharmaceutical products. Very, very, very bad timing, however. The date is 1913. Not a good time for Germany to be going into pharmaceutical production because it's on the eve of the First World War. However, ironically, it turns out that Salvarsan would have been an extremely good thing to produce in mass amounts in the First World War because, again, venereal disease becomes a huge problem. Mass troop movements, prostitutes following the troops, as it were. There's numerous public interest adverts like that, like the innocent wife and child, and the blokes being told, don't take a chance. They're not very explicit in adverts in those days, but nobody has any doubt about what it means. It means don't go to prostitutes when you're away at the war. Stay away from them because you may come back with a disease and you'll then pass that on to your wife and possibly any children that you have. What they were still suggesting, as you can see here, is prophylactic. They thought condoms, or very rough and ready ones, would do. And look at here, still with us. Calomel, which has got, guess what, mercury in it. Same as they had back in the 16th century. It hasn't moved on, really, has it? So it would have been very good if Salvarsan could have been produced in slightly larger amounts, but because of the war, the German pharmaceutical industry had collapsed a bit, as it did immediately after the war. Any of you who know, this is how wars can affect things, even like medical science. After the First World War, Germany really collapses. Its whole economy collapses. It's in a huge mess for the whole of the 1920s. Not a good time for the pharmaceutical industry to get going. So we move geographically then for what used to be considered the real success story in this magic bullet story. The real magic bullet. And the hero of this story, although we'll see he's not quite such a hero as we might think, is this bloke here. Sitting at his research desk in St. Mary's Hospital in London in the late 1920s. You can see his dates here. Only died in 1955. He was a young researcher at St. Mary's. St. Mary's Hospital still there. very eminent kind of hospital in London, so he had a good position. He'd come down from Scotland. He'd done a lot of work on bacterially infected wounds in the trenches. He'd gone out, he'd examined the wounds, how they were. Far more men, as we know now, in the First World War died of wounds than they actually did of being blown up or shot, because the wounds became so infected and there was nothing much you could do with them. So you've got the double whammy. The venereal disease, the syphilis, which nothing can be done about, and the horrible infected wounds from the trenches, which men slowly died of. So Fleming has done this work. He was an untidy man. This is a bit of a kind of fairy story, this one. Whether we actually believe it or not is another thing. But him being untidy is part of it. Why? Well, look at his bench here. Not very orderly. By a window, he's got stuff all over the place. He's looking down his microscope. But it's not a nice, orderly sort of research, as you might expect, in a way. What happens? Well, this is what the story says. The story says that Fleming goes away for a holiday. Summertime, not necessarily very warm in Britain, of course, but he goes away. And because he's an untidy man, he doesn't tidy up any of the stuff on his desk. And what happens? According to the story, which is not quite true, as we'll see, mould spores come in through the window and land on some of his Petri dishes that he's left just lying around. You were supposed to put antiseptic over them and soak them before you left. He hadn't bothered to do that. So all the bacterial samples that he'd gathered, he'd been doing research on nose secretions. Maybe not very interesting, but still could be useful. And a lot of this stuff had just been left on the Petri dishes. The story says that the mould spore that came through the window landed on the Petri dishes. Well, we think that's a bit of a story, because actually this window here apparently was very, very unlikely to be opened. And Fleming wasn't much of a window opener at the best of times. So that seems a bit unlikely. It seems much more likely, it actually, perhaps more unlikely, came up the stairs and in the door. Because down below at St. Mary's, some of his colleagues were doing research into allergies, and they were using things like spores of mould, which of course we know can cause allergies. So if it came from anywhere, that's probably where it came from. Nobody really knows. But whatever. The important thing about this story is that Fleming noticed. And that's so often the case. It's not necessarily being a genius. It's not even always being in the right place at the right time. If you're going to make your mark in whatever area you're in, it's a question of paying attention and noticing. Rather unlikely person to do it, but he did. He noticed that on this Petri dish, the mould that had landed there had actually inhibited the growth of the bacteria. Normally, bacteria would have inhabited the whole Petri dish. You could see, and in fact, they've kept the famous Petri dish, well, that's what they say it is anyway, that actually got inhibited. So there's the mould, and here's not very many little bits of bacteria. Normally, they would have been all over the place. Who knows whether this is the real one or not? But it's so famous that they kept it and put it in this sort of gold celebration box, as it were. Aha, thinks Alexander Fleming. I've invented penicillin. No, he doesn't. He doesn't think that at all. What he does think is, this could be interesting. In fact, if I got the mould, if I kind of precipitated it in some fluid, perhaps I could use it for topical infections. Boils, carbuncles, abscesses, stuff that people got very commonly on their skin, and there was no cure for it. Okay, he wrote a 1928 paper on penicillin, by which he called it by that time, because the mould was penicillium mould. And he didn't do anything else. He wrote the paper, nobody much read it. He went round his colleagues at St. Mary's and said, how would you like me to have a go with my mould juice on your sore on your arm? They said yes or no, depending on whether they were keen for that to happen. Some of it was a bit successful, but it's not the massive, great story you would think, given that it was actually penicillin. Okay, moving on quickly. Also, I think I said that. Not much further work because actually this mold juice was pretty unstable and unreliable, quite frankly. Okay, so here we come to hero number 2, perhaps a little bit more likely, although not much. Who is he? Well, you should all know him. His name is Howard Florey. Is that familiar to you? No, you see, poor old Howard. He's Australian. He's from Adelaide. He went over to Britain in the First World War because there was not much research going on in Australia. And he went to the University of Oxford. He's actually, I think he used to, I don't know if he still is, he used to be on one of the notes, one of the Treasury notes. Sure which one it was. He may have been taken off since, because nobody knows who he is anymore. But you should know, because he really did some great work. He had a team at the Dunn School of Pathology in Oxford. And what did they do? They isolated, purified, and tested this mold juice on mice. They did it in a very rough and ready way because they didn't have much money. This was Britain, 1930s, no grant money available. Again, they're scaling up for war, aren't they? So they did it on a wing and a prayer, basically. They used milk churns, lemonade bottles, bedpans, baths, all the rest of it, to try and get a fluid that was stable and that was injectable, and that had this penicillin in it, that looked as if it could actually cure something. So Dr. Ethel Florey, who was his wife, she'd gone over to Britain with him. She was a medical doctor. She gave this penicillin to the patients. This obviously isn't Howard Florey, it's Dominic West. In a later television production, that's his wife Ethel in the background, and that's some of his team. This, when it's written about, is written about almost in religious terms. It was a miracle, they thought. They gave patients in the infirmary where Ethel was working this stuff, and look what happens. This poor little girl who's had horrible, horrible infections on her face. You can see there, it's still pretty awful. By 3, she's had a few injections, and it's better. By 4, she's almost back to normal. And by 5 and 6, she looks exactly the way she did before. In the past, she would have stayed at 1 and died. They really can't believe this. They do it on quite a few patients. Unfortunately, they can't do it for many more because they run out of penicillin. They just haven't got enough. But it looks absolutely amazing. So what does Florey do? Does the government jump up and down and say, oh, we'll give you lots of money for this? No, because it's in the middle of the war. He goes to America. And here's one of the first cases of mass production of a really effective therapeutic in the USA. America's not in the war yet. They don't come in until 1943, I think it is. So they're free to do peacetime production. Florey is not a salesman. He's a very quiet, diffident sort of bloke, but he pushes himself. He's so determined to get this mass-produced, particularly as it's during the war. So America sets up mass production, and they appear to have produced a safe and effective broad-spectrum antibiotic. Amazing. However, of course, it doesn't affect everything, as we know. If you happen to have a viral infection, it doesn't do anything, and there are, unfortunately, allergies. People are allergic, and they get some nasty reactions, although not so many that it would make you feel it was unusable. So America puts this into mass production, but because it's during the war, there are problems. Meantime, Fleming has remembered that he actually started all this off. So he jumps up and down and says, look, come on, come on. I need a bit of recognition here. And he gets photographed, as you can see, but older by now, at his desk. He's still got all the Petri dishes. He's got all the props round about him. It turns out that the media love him. He's Scottish. He's got a broad Scottish accent, but they think that's cute. He goes really well down in America. He can talk, unlike Florey, who's a bit reticent. He broadcasts, as you can see, for the BBC here. And quite frankly, he does take more kudos for this than he probably actually deserves. Nevertheless, he did kick it off. We'll see what happens in a minute about that one. Meanwhile, there are worse problems, ethical problems. This is what you get when you have a drug that works. We've still got them today. There was a program on the ABC about it last night, about a girl who had cancer, and she discovered a drug that would actually at least halt it, if not cure it. It's going to cost a fortune because there's so little of it. So anything that's seriously effective is going to have a problem of not being enough of it, it being very expensive, and so ethical problems about who do you give it to. Do you give it to children with wounds, like the broken leg that this little girl's got, to heal them up? Or do you give it to the servicemen and women who are in the war? If you give it to them, does that not just mean they're going to go out and get shot and killed again, so it's a waste of the penicillin? So there are all kinds of ethical problems that really haven't altogether been solved these days, not with penicillin, but with other drugs. Very tricky. There's a cache of letters written to Mrs. Roosevelt, who was the wife of the president at the time, from mothers of America, saying, please give our children penicillin. Stop sending them off to the penicillin off to these servicemen. America's now in the war. They're just suffering from venereal disease. They don't deserve it. Our children deserve it. So here's a real problem. Do you deserve a drug? A real problem, this one. Okay, moving on quickly. So the ethics of the magic bullet, as I've said, for venereal disease, a not very polite picture about syphilis and gonorrhea. Plainly, none of this lot deserve it. They're very, very undeserving. But again, penicillin is being given the propaganda of actually curing. So if it's saying that, does that mean that the men and women who are suffering from this will simply think, oh, well, all I need to do is swallow a pill or have an injection. It won't matter whether I'm putting myself at risk of getting these diseases. So all these problems start coming up, which have never really come up very much in medicine before. Haven't really solved them yet. Okay, who gets the fame? Aha. Alexander Fleming gets on the cover of Time magazine, but here we are, I knew he was there somewhere. Florey gets on the $50 note in Australia. So fame of a sort. But, who gets the Nobel Prize? Different issue. Well, the 1945 Nobel Prize went to Fleming, not in this picture, but also to Florey, who's there, and one of his collaborators, Ernest Chain, because he didn't just do it by himself, he recognized that he had a team around him. There was a good deal of controversy about this Nobel Prize, about who deserved it, but you'll know even nowadays, it's amazingly prestigious to get. And it really helps your research, it helps your lab, it raises your profile. So there was a bit of controversy about Fleming, who basically had retired by then. You know, what good was it going to do him? However, he did share in it, as it turned out. Okay, moving on very quickly then. Looks as if everything's great. Healthy and confident. The 1950s and 60s, penicillin for all. Nobody will have bacterial infections anymore. Sadly, not quite true. Because anything that's going to be that effective is, of course, going to be used a lot. And there's no doubt about it, penicillin was used a lot. Not entirely the fault of physicians, because, as we know nowadays, there's an aspect of patients demanding it. You have a bacterial infection, you're coughing, say it's just a bacterial throat, something like strep throat. You don't want to put up with that. Probably, we'll come back to this point in a minute, if you left it for a few days or a week or so, you'd probably get better by yourself, which most people did. But in modern life, who wants to do that? People don't want you around coughing and spluttering all over them. They don't want your germs. We want instant cure. And that was what it appeared antibiotics did. But, of course, nobody had thought that the microbes would be a bit smarter. So gradually you get resistance to antibiotics, penicillin in particular. And also, unfortunately, too many antibiotics compromised immunity. Your immune system, which is pretty good, otherwise none of us would be here, obviously, is a good fighter. But if it's constantly being compromised by antibiotics, it's not going to be as tough as it was, unfortunately. So as it turned out, although nobody saw it at the time, there was a bit of a disaster looming. It wasn't a happy ending, so we're not going to have a happy ending, as you can see. What was the not happy ending? The not happy ending was also rather tactlessly referred to as the return of the plague. AIDS. Not good. By the late 60s and 70s, it was apparent that something had emerged, although nobody was quite sure what it was. Was this something that had come out of Africa? It was a suggestion that, in fact, one of the first patients had come from the African continent, but nobody could be completely sure about that. What they were sure of was the people who suffered from it in the West, first of all. And they're the ones who got the high profile, because they were in Western cities, like New York, San Francisco, London, Sydney. People with haemophilia who needed blood transfusions to live, intravenous drug users, people who were injecting themselves either with legal or illegal drugs, but just the fact of injecting. Hypodermic syringes in those days weren't disposable. They were used over and over again. Fortunately, you hoped, sterilized in between, but not always. So infections could be very easily passed on into the bloodstream. And likewise, the homosexual community. End of the 60s, early 70s, homosexuality wasn't a crime anymore, which it certainly was before. So a lot of people were making a lot of the time that it wasn't criminal anymore. So something was going on. Unintended consequences. As I've said, hypodermic syringes that were in fact infected. Nobody had bothered all that much about the sterilization before, because nothing much, I mean, apparently the odd bug, maybe that just gave you a topical infection, was passed on. Nobody thought of something actually going into the bloodstream. Blood transfusions, this was a new wonderful way to treat people with haemophilia. That's the bleeding disease, where you get a cut or you get an injury, and instead of the blood clotting, which it does in most people, it didn't. So a blood transfusion will help with the clotting of the blood. This had looked so good. It was all good. Sexual freedom, oh, wonderful. And it all looked as if it was leading to this unfortunate health crisis, which it certainly was. Not that it wasn't a health crisis in other countries as well, but it was much more obvious in countries in the West, and particularly industrialized countries. Okay, what did they do? Well, they did what you would have expected. Approaches. Drugs, yes. But initially, they thought it was a bacteria, because bacterial diseases were much more common. And remember, it's wonderful if it's a bacteria, because you can just hit it with antibiotics. So that was the first suggestion, that you would hit this horrible disease, and it was horrible. It was one of the early AIDS was one of those diseases like syphilis that would come out in facial rashes. So it was almost like a stigma on your face that you couldn't disguise. There's Kaposi's sarcoma, which came out, like that picture I showed you earlier. Really horrible. Okay, great, we've got antibiotics. Of course we can hit this. And if by any chance we can't, we'll go back to the healthy living idea. We'll explain to people all the risks, and we'll just say, live a more healthy life, and you won't get it. Well, as it turned out, of course, neither of them actually worked. It turned out not to be a bacterial, although there were secondary bacterial infections that came up, which certainly could be cured. But the actual virus in the blood, unfortunately, couldn't. It took a long time before anybody came up with any therapeutic that would actually do very much good at all. And even the healthy living wasn't a tremendous help if a virus was actually being passed on in the bloodstream, really eating well, having exercise. It toned up your body a bit, certainly, and made it easier perhaps to resist, but that was about as far as you could go. So it was a bit of a downer, quite honestly. Remember Panacea and Hygeia from the very first lecture? The two approaches in medicine. If one doesn't work, the other one will. It's a bit depressing when it appears that neither of them actually does. So what happened? Well, fear was brought in as not a very good approach. The Grim Reaper, you're all probably too young to remember this with any luck. It used to be on television. They'd have this bloke who was actually looked a bit peculiar, but was supposed to be scary. The Grim Reaper information on television. He would come along, there'd be a whole lot of people standing around, like a normal demographic, men, women, children, old people, young people, and with his scythe he'd be going like this, which was not quite true, because to be perfectly honest, everybody wasn't at risk of AIDS. But what it did was, apparently, raise our ancestral memory, apparently. This is a bit unbelievable, to be perfectly honest. But a lot of articles were written about the effect of this on television. Apparently, it was stimulating something in our minds that was taking us back to the bubonic plague of the 14th century. We were remembering how awful it was, and this was why we were scared. Nobody seemed to think we might actually be scared because it was a horrible disease. I didn't quite know why it had to be so complicated. However, it didn't altogether have a happy ending. It had a sort of happy-ish ending. We didn't find the magic bullet for this one, but we did find something that could at least affect it. So, in fact, what did happen was AIDS, instead of being an acute, horrible, you die immediately disease, turned into a chronic one, which we still have, of course. And this phrase to do with that was living with AIDS. So it's not a chronic disease that you necessarily have to feel terribly debilitated about, provided you take the medications, but you live with it. And this is one of the first diseases that really gets this kind of this kind of rhetoric around it, that you can live with it and we can manage it. So it's not really Hygeia, it's not really Panacea, it's a kind of 21st century version of how you can approach a disease. So finally then, current research, back to what I started with. Perhaps we've ended up nowadays, 2016, with the notion that there's really no good or bad microbes. This is confusing, because going back a little bit, it was perfectly obvious which were the good ones and which were the bad ones. Even now, if you Google it, you'll see lots of pictures of where the good microbes are and where the bad microbes are. And we want the good ones, but we don't want the bad ones. But it turns out it's not quite as simple as that. It depends on the situation. It depends on what part of the body they're in. It depends on what else is happening to your body. And it turns out that killing a whole lot of them, even the bad ones, nominally bad ones, isn't necessarily such a good idea, because they're all sort of intertwined with each other in ways that we're actually only just discovering. Some things protect against other things. Things that we would normally want to knock out, maybe they've actually protected us from something worse later on. Autoimmune diseases, for example, that's a suggestion, that having early infections can actually protect you later on from autoimmune. But then do you want the early infections? And, of course, the risk of dying of them. So it's not an easy solution. Is it then better to let the body heal itself, like the Hippocratics would have claimed? The good body, left to itself, given a bit of exercise and good food and a good environment, you'll throw off all your sickness. But the trouble is, as I'm pointing out here, at least in Western industrialized countries, we have very high expectations of health. The notion of the magic bullet, although of course it didn't kill everything and it's been a bit undermined these days, gave us the mindset that things can be got rid of quickly and easily and painlessly, and that's what we should expect. Not like our ancestors did, suffering through weeks of ill health and then finally getting well at the end, as people in many countries still do today, of course. But we want the quick fix. So we've got very high expectations of good health. So are the perhaps not so magic bullets still necessary? Because we may be facing a future where, in fact, not many of them are actually all that effective, as it turns out. So, as I've said, not a terribly happy ending, as it would have been if I'd done this lecture about 50 years ago. Next week, we'll finish off, because it will actually be the last actual lecture next week. I'll talk about the speckled monster and whatever that was, and also controversies over immunization, which is, of course, the other way of presenting diseases. And we'll also talk about Australia for a change. Okay, see you all next week.